How medieval peasants survived the plague, hunger, and the lords. Chapter 1. The life beneath the castle. Long before the sickness came, long before hunger hollowed out the bellies of children, and long before the sound of hooves brought fear instead of news, there was a rhythm to the life of the village. It was not an easy life, nor a soft one, but it was known, steady, and shared. In a clearing nestled between thick forests and the river that rarely froze, the peasants lived in cottages of timber and straw. Smoke curled gently from crooked chimneys, and the scent of wood smoke and soup herbs often filled the air in the evening. Their world was small, yet full of fields, family, and faith. They did not own the land. It belonged to the Lord, a distant, well-fed, armored, and unseen. His castle stood high on the hill like a stone crown, watching. From it came demands of grain, meat, wool, and coin. In return came little more than permission to survive. But the villagers, tired though they often were, found peace in simple things: the warmth of fire, the hush of snow, the comfort of work done together. Evenings were quiet and slow. Children listened to stories by firelight. Old songs were sung to lull little ones to sleep. And in those moments, even the weight of the Lord's taxes seemed far away. But that quiet would not last. The storm was gathering. Chapter 2. The years of hunger. The first signs were in the sky. The rains came and would not stop. Clouds clung to the heavens like bruises, and the fields drowned before they could grow. The barley turned to mush. The wheat sprouted yellow and limp. The potatoes rotted where they lay. With the failed harvest came fear. The stores from the previous year were already thin, and now there was no promise of more. Bread became a rare thing, salted meat, a memory. Even the rats in the granary began to vanish, and still the hunger grew. Mothers gave their meals to their children. Men went into the woods to find roots, bark, or anything that might pass for food. A stew of boiled weeds and moss became a delicacy. Some traded old boots for sacks of beans, others gave away heirlooms for stale flour. And then the Lord's men arrived. They wore fine cloaks and rode well-fed horses. They carried ledgers, swords, and cold smiles. His grace still requires his due, they said, their voices flat. The crown's needs do not change with the weather. But the village had nothing left. So the men took livestock. They took blankets. They took what little grain was stored for winter. And when a few peasants begged them to take pity, the men laughed. That winter was the longest anyone could remember. Bellies growled through the night. Alders faded in their sleep. But the villagers leaned on each other, sharing, mourning, enduring. They made blankets from rags. They dug deep into the snow to find buried roots. They sang softly at night to hush the hunger. And when spring finally came, there was little joy. For the earth was not kind that year either, and something darker had begun to creep through the countryside. Chapter 3. The Black Wind. The first who fell was a traveler. He had come from the city, pale, sweating, weak. They let him sleep in the stable. By morning, he was dead. By the next evening, so was the stable boy who had brought him water. The sickness moved like shadow, silent and everywhere. It did not strike all at once. First, a cough. Then fever. Then the dark swelling beneath the arms, and the scent of death. Some recovered. Most did not. The priest tried to calm the people, saying God was testing them. The old healer offered herbs and hope, but her hands trembled more each day. Graves were dug hastily in frozen ground. The chapel bell rang so often that people began to fear its sound. Even the Lord's men stopped coming. Still, the villagers did not abandon each other. Mala, the healer, moved from home to home, cleaning wounds, whispering prayers, wrapping the dead in cloth when their families were too weak to do so. Children began tending fires. Neighbors shared not only food, but care. It was a time of terrible quiet, but in that silence, something new grew: courage. When the plague at last passed like a cruel wind lifting, the village was smaller, thinner, haunted but alive. They planted again, though their hands were fewer. They sang again, though their songs were softer. They remembered every name that now rested beneath the earth. They survived not because the world was kind but because they were kind to one another. Chapter 4. Ashes and green shoots. Spring arrived not with joy, but with quiet breath. A mist over the fields, a pale sun above shattered trees. The earth, long frozen and silent, began to soften. Beneath the black weight of grief, seeds waited. Life, as it always does, tried to return. The peasants moved carefully through the season. They planted with fewer hands, dug with weaker arms, but every seed sown was an act of defiance, a quiet promise whispered into the soil. Children, now motherless or fatherless, followed elders into the fields, carrying baskets. Learning to live, they marked the losses not in days or months, but in empty chairs and quiet paths. But they also marked the return of sound, a rooster's crow, a cart's creak, a lullaby sung once more at twilight. In the ruins of suffering, they built again, not with stone, but with patience. No help came from the castle. The Lord's taxes did not cease. But fewer men came down the hill now. Perhaps they were frightened. Perhaps they were sick themselves. Perhaps they simply stopped caring. And so the villagers began to rely only on each other. They traded not with coin, but with care. A pair of boots for a blanket. A bundle of onions for a night of watchful fire tending. Mala, the healer, now bent with age and sorrow, trained the children in herbs. You will need to know, she said, because this world will not stop testing us. Still, the fields turned green. Chapter 5. The return of the Lord's shadow. Summer warmed the valley, and with it, the sound of hooves returned. At first, the villagers hoped it was news, perhaps a gift of food, or the lifting of taxes. But the riders wore no kindness on their faces. Only armor. The Lord had not forgotten them. He had simply waited until the worst had passed. His men dismounted, counted heads, and spoke of back taxes, of grain owed, of service unpaid. The war has drained the coffers, one of them said. His grace requires double tithes this year. Thomas, whose son had died that winter, said nothing. He simply stared. Ellen, once the wife of a blacksmith, now both mother and plowhand, stepped forward. We cannot give what we do not have, she said. Her voice did not shake. The men laughed. You'll find a way, one replied, or we'll find another use for your land. And so the peasants gathered again that evening, not in fear, but in thought. They had survived famine. They had buried their dead with dignity. They had nursed one another in plague. Now, the cruelty of the living asked more of them than death ever had. They could not fight, not with swords, but they could survive in other ways. They began hiding grain deep beneath the cold stones of their homes. They built false cellars, false walls, kept the best of their yield for themselves. They planted gardens in the forest's shadow, far from prying eyes. They worked together in silence, as the foxes and birds did. They would not rise in open rebellion, but they would no longer break beneath the weight of gold they never held. Chapter 6. Fire without. Smoke. The year turned, and the lords brought more than soldiers. They brought scribes, men who wrote down names and debts, who measured land and calculated burdens. They came not with swords, but with parchment and ink, and it felt heavier than iron. One day, they came from Mala. Too old to kneel, too wise to beg, she stood with her herbs on her and said nothing. Which? One of them whispered. A healer who serves herself before her Lord. She was taken in the night. No one saw where. That week, the chapel bell rang not for the dead, but for silence. And still, the village did not bend. A girl named Annette, only 12, took Mala's place. She had watched. She remembered. She ground herbs with trembling hands and whispered the same words. You heal not with magic, she said, but with remembering. The peasants learned to speak in signals, in songs. A line of clothes drying meant danger. A stone turned in the garden meant grain nearby. They began to outwit the collectors, giving just enough to seem obedient, hiding the rest like squirrels before frost. By the fire each night, they told stories. Not of kings or saints, but of each other. Of how Howland broke a plow but mended it with a spoon. Of how Thomas once held a gate against wolves with nothing but a shovel. Of how little Annette whispered over a fevered baby until it slept peacefully. And so their fire never smoked high. Their joy never rang loud. But it lasted. Like moss on stone, like roots in winter, quiet and strong. They had no power. But they had each other. And in that, there was more strength than any lord could steal. Chapter 7. Quiet Alliances. As the years rolled forward like a cart over rutted paths, something shifted beneath the surface of the village, not loudly. Not suddenly, but like the slow growth of ivy on stone. The people were learning not just to endure, but to think beyond endurance. One day, a traveler arrived. He was no merchant, nor a soldier, but a monk, quiet-eyed, soft-spoken, walking with a limp and carrying scrolls under his robes. His name was Brother Aldrich. He did not preach from pulpits or demand tithe. Instead, he listened. He slept in the barn, shared soup with the children, and watched the fields with interest. When Ellen asked why he stayed, he said only, "Because your people have more wisdom than they know, and more worth than your Lord sees." A few villagers feared he might be a spy, but others saw something else, a crack in the wall. Someone who spoke Latin, who had seen the cities and the nobles, yet chose to sit beside them on rough-hewn benches. Over time, he taught the older children their letters, not to challenge the church, but to give them names for the things they already knew. Plants, tools, stars. Knowledge not as rebellion, but as survival. From him, they learned that some lords were falling, weakened by debt, plague, and war. That change crept across the kingdom like smoke, slow, invisible, but everywhere. And though they did not raise flags or forge weapons, the peasants began to understand that the ground beneath their bare feet belonged to them more than to any crown above. Chapter 8. The Winter of Silence. It was a harsh winter, harsher even than the one that followed the plague. The snow fell early and did not lift. Trees cracked from the cold. The river froze deep, and wind howled through the cottage walls like wolves too thin to hunt. This time, they were ready. They had stored more than grain. They had stored knowledge, skill, memory. They packed straw between the walls for warmth. They sealed windows with tallow and cloth. They cooked thick root soups that fed many with little. But even with all their care, there was loss. Old Thomas, who had once held the gate against wolves, passed quietly in his sleep. No one wept loudly. Instead, they sat by his hearth and spoke of the time he taught 3 boys to sharpen scythes in a single afternoon. That was how they grieved now, through story. Children grew older during that winter, not in years, but in eyes. They learned patience, stillness, and how to read the sky. They memorized when frost came earliest, when to feed the goats, how to know a fever from a chill. And still, they told stories by firelight. Not just of saints and kings, but of themselves. Of Malay and Annette, of the day Ellen threw a taxman's scroll into the stove, and how no one ever spoke of it again. Of how Brother Aldrich wrote down their names, one by one, so they would not be forgotten. Winter held them long in its grip, but it did not break them, for they were no longer the same villagers who once bowed at every hoofbeat. They were survivors. And they were learning the quiet power of being many even in silence. Chapter 9. The Festival. Beneath the trees. When at last the snow began to melt, and the first green broke through the brown, no one remembers who has suggested a feast. Not to honor a lord. Not for a wedding or a birth. But simply because they were alive. They gathered under the old trees near the field's edge, where the sun warmed the roots and birds sang high above. Tables were built from planks and barrels. Flowers were woven into garlands. The children were given the task of preparing songs. Each family brought something. A loaf of rye. A pot of honeyed porridge. Berries preserved in the coldest part of the stream. One family brought nothing but a carved whistle, and that too was treasured. They did not call it a festival. They called it a remembering. They remembered the ones they had lost to Thomas Malay, and the quiet stable boy from long ago. They remembered the hunger, and the hands that shared crusts. They remembered the fevered nights and the hands that cooled foreheads. But they also remembered laughter, Ellen told a joke so old no one knew the ending. And it didn't matter. And it danced, now taller, her steps light, and full of something the village had not seen in years, hope. Brother Aldrich read aloud a poem he claimed was ancient, but some swore he wrote it himself. And when the sun dipped low and the sky turned gold, the villagers did not go home quickly. They stayed, as though afraid the moment would vanish if they blinked. That night, the stars looked kinder, and the village slept not just in peace, but in quiet joy, the kind earned only by those who had walked through fire and chosen not to burn, but to grow. Chapter 10. Shadows on the Ridge. It was in late summer, just before the grain harvest, when they saw the banners again. 3 of them, tattered red and gold, rising beyond the hills like a warning. The Lord's men had returned. This time, they didn't ride in shouting orders. They walked a fewer in number, their horses thin, their eyes wary. The war had not gone well for those in the castles. Nobles argued over borders and bloodlines. Gold was scarcer than grain. Even knights needed bread. They came not to take, but to ask. The villagers watched from the edges of fields as the captain approached. Ellen met him, her hands on her hips, unafraid, and it stood behind her, taller now, holding the shepherd's staff like a spear of peace. The captain removed his helmet. His grace seeks aid, not just tax. He offers parchment, freedom for land. It was an offer unthinkable years before, the possibility of owning the land they'd worked for generations, but also a risk. Parchment could burn, promises faded in wind, Brother Aldrich said. Little, but his brow furrowed deep. Careful, he whispered. A gift from those in power is never without weight. The villagers gathered under the old tree, the one with roots like arms. They passed the parchment between hands. No one could read it but Aldrich, and he did it slowly, carefully. Words of freedom. Words of condition. Words that bound as much as they released. In the end, they chose not to answer, not yet. Instead, they watched the banners retreat over the ridge, leaving behind questions and the distant sound of drums, not of war, but of change. Chapter 11. The Fire That Stayed Contained. Autumn fell quietly that year. Like a sigh across the hills, the trees blazed gold, then surrendered their leaves without struggle. The nights chilled early, but no one feared winter as before. They were prepared not just with food, but with each other. One cold morning, smoke was seen near the edge of the forest. Not the curling smoke of a cook fire, but thick, black, angry. They ran at buckets, rags, bare hands. A small barn had caught fire. No one knew how. Perhaps a coal had slipped. Perhaps the wind had turned wrong. Fire did not care for reasons. But neither did the villagers hesitate. They formed a line, old and young, passing water in cracked pots and wooden bowls. They shouted not in panic but in rhythm. More here, careful there, and when it was over, the fire choked, the walls scorched but still standing. They sat together in the ash. No animals lost. No lives taken. Just smoke in their clothes and the sting of heat in their lungs. It wasn't the fire that mattered. It was how they faced it. Later that night, they lit a different fire, a controlled one in the center of the village. Not for warmth, but for story. Each person added a log. Not for fuel, but for thanks. Ellen said, "We used to fear fire like a beast. Now we meet it like a guest." And it sang an old lullaby. Aldrich added kindling from a scroll no longer useful. And together they watched the flames, not in fear, but in remembrance of what they could lose and what they could still save. Chapter 12. The first letter sent. The idea came from Aldrich, but it was not his alone. He said, "If lords can send messages by horse and wax, so can we. But we are no lords," said a boy. "No," Aldrich replied, "we are something older." So they wrote a letter, not a request, not a plea. A statement, a record. It told the story of the village. Not its taxes or yields, but its people. Their births. Their songs. Their losses. Their survival. "We send this," Alan said, "so that someone remembers. So they cannot say we were only shadows in fields. They gave the letter to a traveler heading toward the city. No gold was exchanged, only bread and a blessing. Days passed. Then weeks. No reply came, and none was expected. But it had been sent. And in that act in the ink, the seal, the courage as something shifted again. They were no longer just a village in a valley. They were a voice, small but rising. A seed had been planted, not in soil, but in memory. And they would keep writing. Chapter 13. The day the map arrived. It was early spring when the messenger arrived. He did not wear a noble crest nor carry a sword. Just a worn leather satchel and boots dusted from weeks of travel. He asked for no one in particular, only held out a folded parchment and said, "They said to give this to the ones who remember." The villagers gathered in the barn, the same place where they once stored the sick during the plague. Alan carefully unrolled the parchment. It was a map, but not of kingdoms. This one showed rivers and named by lords, hills that had no place in royal charts. And dotted along a curving path, villages. Villages like theirs. Marked not with banners, but with hand-carved symbols, a sheaf of wheat, a crooked barn, a crescent moon. Brother Aldrich traced the lines slowly. They wrote back, he whispered. Others like us. The map was not just parchment. It was proof that their voice had been heard. That they were not alone in the fields and forests, not forgotten between cities and crowns. The people stayed long into the night, studying it. Children dreamed of the crooked barn symbol. Elders whispered names they'd heard only once, long ago, on market roads. For the first time in living memory, the village knew it was part of something larger than its fences. The map was hung above the hearth in the common hall not as decoration, but as direction. They would not travel tomorrow, but they would be ready. Chapter 14. The bread made for three. That summer brought warmth and bees, ripe berries on the hedges, and air so thick with sunlight that even the stones seemed to soften. But not everyone shared in the plenty. One morning, a boy arrived on foot from a neighboring village marked on the new map. His name was Jory, and he was bone-thin, lips cracked, his voice nearly gone. No rain, he rasped. No grain. We've nothing. Alan didn't speak. She simply took his hand and led him to the hearth, where the women were baking. They made bread that day, not the hard, dry loaves for travel, but the soft kind made for guests. Bread meant to be broken with others. And for every loaf, they made three. One for their own, one for Jory's people, and one more, always one more. Children packed baskets, men offered to carry them, and it led the way, a bell tied to her staff so the sound would warn birds and greet strangers. They walked over hills once feared, now known. When they reached the other village, the air smelled of silence, but people still waited. Thin and wary, no words passed at first, just the offering of baskets. Then came tears, a whispered thank you, a song hummed by an old woman whose hands shook as she took a loaf, and as they returned home, empty-handed but full-hearted. The bell on Annette's staff rang with a kind of joy not heard in years. That night, they baked again, not because they had plenty, but because they could choose to share it. Chapter 15. The names in the book. It began with a single page, sewn between scraps of old cloth. Aldrich had saved it from an abbey long since burned. Books are not only for kings, he had said once. They are for keeping what matters, so they made one their own. Each page was filled slowly. A child's birth. A marriage beneath the oak. The first cabbage of the season. The day the goat gave birth to twins. The day they walked to the village beyond the ridge. Names filled the top of every page. Not only of people, but of things they refused to forget. The red shawl that Mala always wore. The song Ellen's mother used to hum. The words that the boy Jory brought from the dry fields, hope is bred with a name. The book was wrapped in wool and kept beside the map. At night, they took turns reading from it, not always aloud, sometimes silently, with fingers tracing each letter. As if reminding the page, I was here, I still am, one evening. And it added her own name, not just her given name. but the one the children had begun to call her a bellkeeper. And Aldrich, growing older, smiled as he added the last line of the night. This book is not for kings. It is for us. It holds no spells, but it keeps us together. And as long as we write, we do not disappear. That night, the stars returned early. And the village slept, their names safe, their stories written, their world larger than it had ever been before. Chapter 16. The day the snow returned. The first snow came early that year, silent, steady, and soft as breath. It arrived not with warning, but with stillness. The forest hushed. The river stilled, and the sky turned to paper white. Ellen stood outside her door, watching the flakes drift down like forgotten feathers. Behind her, the children gathered with wide eyes, whispering old rhymes their grandmothers once sang. First snow hides the sorrow, second snow hides the sound, third snow brings the quiet that roots us to the ground. In the barn, they laid fresh straw. In the hearth, the fire was fed, but this time, no one feared the cold as they once had. They had wood stacked high, dried herbs and linen sacks, barrels of grain and dried fruit, and more than anything each other. Aldrich spent the evening telling stories, his voice raspier now, but still warm, and it hung bells at the doors again, not to warn of spirits, but simply to welcome sound into the hush, and the snow kept falling. By morning, the world outside had vanished beneath a soft white veil, but inside, laughter crackled like the fire. They would be snowed in for days, perhaps weeks. But for the first time, no one minded, because this was not the same winter they once feared. Chapter 17. The messenger who stayed. When the storm finally passed, they opened the doors to a world sculpted in frost. Trees glistened like glass. The path to the ridge was gone, replaced by drifting mounds. And yet, that morning, a shape appeared at the edge of the trees, cloaked in furs, feet dragging, hands raw. A traveler. He collapsed near the gate. And Annette was the first to reach him. Easy now, she whispered, brushing snow from his cheeks. His lips moved with no sound. In his back, no weapon, only ink and parchment. They brought him inside. He slept 3 days without waking, warmed by the fire, fed broth by the spoonful. On the 4th, he finally opened his eyes and spoke one word, letters. His name was Tomir, a scribe from the northern hills, where the plague had taken all but a few. He had traveled from village to village, carrying news and names, collecting stories from the outer edges of forgotten lands. I didn't know where else to go, he said softly. But your map reached us. And your letter. They gave him a corner in the hall, paper, ink, and quiet. Not just to rest, but to write. Soon, he was adding names to their book. Not only of those still alive, but of the ones lost along the way. Villages faded to smoke, elders who died singing, children remembered only in lullabies. Tomir never left. He was no longer a messenger. He was one of them now. Chapter 18. The seeds under the floor. By spring, the snow melted in wide rivers, feeding the earth as if it too had slept long and dreamed deeply. The villagers emerged blinking into the light, boots soaked, sleeves rolled, eyes full of quiet purpose. It was planting time, but something new stirred beneath the floorboards of the old granary, where dry earth hadn't been touched in years, and it found something, a bundle wrapped in linen, sealed in wax. They opened it slowly, careful as with a newborn lamb. Inside, seeds. Not grain, but something else, round and dark, unfamiliar. Tomir recognized them. From Far East, he said, bartered for letters, very rare. No one had a name for them in the village town. So they planted them without one. The children watched daily. Will they grow? Are they magic? Owen simply smiled. Everything we plant is magic. Weeks passed. Green shoots appeared, slender, shy, and strong. And though no one knew what fruit or flower would come, they watered it gently, shaded it from wind, and waited with patience passed down through centuries. Because this hope, this act of planting something unseen and unknown, was what had kept them alive through every plague, every hunger, every lord. Not just survival, but faith in spring. Chapter 19. The flower without a name. The plants from the hidden seeds grew tall and wide by midsummer. their leaves smooth and silver green. One dawn, just as the mist was lifting from the earth, Alan found the first bloom. It was like nothing they had ever seen. Pale gold petals, soft as milkweed, and in its center a ring of dark threads, trembling with light. It gave off no scent, yet everyone who stood near it said the air felt sweeter. Children whispered stories around it, calling it starroot or sunsleep, giving it names that meant more to dreams than to farming. But Ellen said gently, "Let it have no name yet. Let it just be ours, for now." More flowers followed. Not many, just enough to form a half circle around the stone path behind the granary. And though no one dared cut them, they gathered near at dusk, sitting in quiet, their hands brushing the leaves, as if touching the petals could give peace to the day. And in a way, it did. The flower did not feed them, nor clothe them. But it reminded them that beauty was not just for kings, nor for summer courts or cathedrals. It could rise from hidden places. It could grow in silence. And it could belong to those who simply waited, watched, and believed. Chapter 20. The Return of the Lord. It had been many seasons since any noble had crossed the village path. So when a rider in silver approached, dust trailing behind him and a banner stitched with falcons at his back, the people stood still. They remembered the taxes, the taken grain, the fields burned for sport. But this man was not the one who had ridden before. He wore the ring, yes, but not the face. "I am sent by Lord Argan," he said, "to take account, to see what is owed." No one spoke. Then Annette stepped forward, her bell gently ringing. She did not shout. She did not kneel. She simply handed the man their book, the one where they had written every name, every harvest, every loss and miracle. He read for a long time. The village waited, not with fear, but with the kind of stillness that says, "We remember who we are." When he finished, he looked up. "This is not what we expected," and it nodded. "It rarely is." He left without taking grain, without naming a tax, without lifting a hand. And whether he would return, whether the lords would come again, no one could say. But the villagers felt no fear. Because now, even if the lords returned, they would not return unchanged. Chapter 21. The Festival of Small Lights. That autumn, when the leaves burned red and gold and wind curled under the doors, Tomir suggested a gathering. Not for harvest, he said. Not for mourning. Just for remembering. They lit small clay lanterns, one for every name in the book of those still alive, and those past. Each family carved a mark on theirs, a feather, a paw print, a spindle, a star. They placed them along the path through the village, lighting them at dusk. The light flickered along the stone, across the fields, and into the dark forest. Children carried their own lights, whispering to them as if they could speak. Elders sang the old, slow songs, meant not to cheer but to hold. No great fire was made, no feast. Just light. Soft and low. Enough to see by. Enough to remember by. And as the stars blinked awake overhead, and the wind stilled just enough to let the flames dance, the village stood together, warm not from fire, but from memory. Because in the end, it was not might that saved them. Not wealth. Not swords. But small things. A flower without a name. A book of names kept safe. A song sung softly. And light enough for one more step forward. Chapter 22. The Bell in the Fog. It began as a low sound one morning, barely more than a hum beneath the fog that rolled in from the river. A bell, not one of their own. Not the iron tongue, and it rang each evening. This one was distant, faint, steady. The children ran to the ridge to listen, their breath making clouds. Elders followed more slowly, hands behind backs, heads tilted. 3 chimes. Then silence. No rider followed, no storm, no fire. Only the bell, heard again at dusk of 3 times, then nothing. For 3 days this happened. Until finally, on the 4th, An old man from the western edge of the village, a Joswin, who spoke little and remembered much, or said softly, "It's the abbey." They had thought the abbey lost in the fires years ago. But now, someone, or something, was ringing its bell. They did not rush to find it. Not out of fear, but out of respect. Sometimes, Olin said, the past calls softly. And the living must wait, must listen, before stepping forward. So the bell became part of the rhythm of the day, a distant song in the fog, reminding them that not all things were gone. Some had simply gone quiet. Chapter 23. The letter with no address. Winter came slower that year, trailing its fingers behind the wind, brushing gently at windows. One afternoon, a boy gathering dry roots near the edge of the wood found something strange beneath the bramble of a bundle, wrapped in waxcloth. Inside, a letter. Its paper was fine, though smudged with time. The seal was broken, but the ink still legible. No name, no place. Only words, "If this finds anyone at all, know that we tried. We planted what we could. We lit the lamps, we sang. We stayed kind. Even when the world was not." The villagers read it around the fire. Tomir copied it into their book, beneath the section labeled Remembrance. Anna placed the letter inside the folds of her shawl. They would never know who wrote it, or when, or from where. But that didn't matter, because they understood the heart of it. They had lived that same line. They too had planted, had stayed, had been kind when kindness was scarce. And now they were not alone, not just in place, but in time. They were part of something larger, something human. Chapter 24. The quiet year. Spring came soft and slow. There were no great events that year. No raids, no sickness, no sudden frost. Just the rhythm of days. Children grew taller. Old roofs were thatched anew. The flowers from the nameless seeds bloomed again, stronger now, and a few villagers swore they changed color in the evening light. A small library grew in the back of the granary, a shelf of copied letters, pages of song, pressed herbs, and sketch maps. Tomir taught anyone who wished to write, even the shepherd's youngest daughter, who made her letters backward but smiled the whole time. The harvest was plain, but enough. The river flowed without flood. And in that quiet year, that blessed, ordinary, and remarkable year, the villagers realized something. They had survived not just winter, or lords, or plague. They had survived the need for fear. Because now they lived in a village that remembered. A village that listened. That planted, and sang, and stayed kind. And when they looked at the stars above, they did not wish to be elsewhere. They simply whispered, "We are here." And it was enough. Chapter 25. The map in the bread oven. It was during the cleaning of the old bakehouse that Garrett found it, not a treasure, not in gold or jewels, but folded tightly behind a loose stone in the oven wall. A map, drawn in charcoal on soft, stretched parchment, its edges curled from heat. It showed no kingdom, no royal road. Only paths between trees, markers like a bent willow or a leaning stone. Symbols, a fish with two tails, a circle inside a circle, a house beneath a hill. No name. No key. No instructions. And yet, Ellen said, it was a kind of letter. It shows what someone loved enough to keep. To draw. To hide. So they didn't treat it as a mystery to solve, but as a memory to hold. They mounted it in the granary beside the library. And once a season, children traced its lines with charcoal, adding new paths, new marks, the flower circle, the bell stone, the clearing where the sun always seemed to linger. It became a living thing, a record of quiet survival. A map of a world not made by kings or battles, but by hands that baked, planted, healed, and hoped. Chapter 26. The last fire of the year. Each year now, just before the frost set in, they built one fire, not for warmth, but for remembering. It was not lit in the center of the village, but out in the field, where the stars were closest. where no walls stood between them and the dark. Each family brought one thing to burn, not out of grief, but out of peace. An old tool no longer needed, a broken reed flute, a pair of worn shoes that had carried someone home again and again. Tomir brought his first written page. Ellen, a piece of the ribbon once tied around her mother's wrist. Even Anna, older now, quieter, brought a single brass bell, the small one she once wore around her neck, now long silent. They placed them gently into the fire, and as the smoke rose, so did the stories. Soft voices under breath, laughter between tears, a psalm hummed without words. Not all memories must be held. Some, to stay beautiful, must be let go. And so they burned. And so they stayed. Chapter 27. The Book of Still Days. Long after even the youngest had grown, and the names in the book had become the names of ancestors, a traveler came to the village. No horse, no banner, only a walking stick and eyes like dawn. He was given a seat, a bowl of stew, and a place by the fire. And there, he asked the question many before him had asked. How did you survive? Tomir's daughter, now gray of hair and firm of voice, handed him a book. The spine worn smooth, the pages patched and ray-bound. Inside, no history of wars, no tales of kings, only days. Still days. The day they fixed the roof, the day the bread did not rise, the day the child first walked, the day the moon hung low and read and no one spoke. He read in silence, page by page, until the fire went low. And when he looked up, he did not ask anything else, because he understood. It was not strength that saved them. It was the way they remembered. And so the book stayed. And so did the fire. And the village, breathing softly beneath the stars, slept on. Chapter 28. The ink made from berries. One evening, as the sky grew honey pink and the wind was soft, Alan's granddaughter, Leora, came running with purple-stained hands and a delighted cry. It writes, she had found a bush, hidden near the old orchard, bearing tiny dark berries that bled color into her palms. Not for eating too bitter, too wild, but when she pressed them on bark and cloth, they left behind marks that stayed. Together with the others, she mashed them with vinegar, boiled them with ash and clover, and tested them with a goose feather. The color turned deep violet black. It clung to the page like a shadow at dusk. From that day on, all new pages in the village book were written in that inkberry ink. They called it its own memory. Children practiced their names with it. Stories were copied in neat, and even letters. Even maps, when redrawn, held its hue now mixed with soot or honey to preserve its soul. And though the color faded slightly over years, it never truly left. Like them it changed, but stayed. Chapter 29. The Stone in the Field. At the edge of the east field stood a stone, not tall, not marked, but it had always been there. No one had moved it. No one knew why it had been placed there in the first place. It had moss on one side and a crack down its middle that caught the snow just so. One spring morning, a small boy named Mar knelt by it. Not to play, just to sit. When asked why, he said softly, "It listens." He didn't mean it moved, or spoke. He meant it was quiet in a way that helped you hear yourself. After that, others began to visit. Some brought thoughts. Others brought tears. One man laid a single bread crust beside it, for no reason at all, just because it felt right. The stone was never carved, never changed. But in the village, when someone said, "I need the stone," others simply nodded. They had weathered lords and plague. They had rebuilt roofs and rewoven nets. But sometimes what kept you whole was a silent witness. And the stone stayed. And so did they. Chapter 30. The Loom in the Attic. Above the baker's house, under dusty beams and faded herbs, they found an old loom. No one knew who had placed it there, or when. The wood was dark and split, but the threads stretched tight and touched, waiting. Leora and 3 others took it down, cleaned the dust with feather fans, and oiled the frame until it breathed again. They did not weave clothes. They wove stories. Strips of old fabric, worn dresses, broken sacks, a sleeve from a lordess' abandoned cloak, were tied together and passed through the loom with quiet fingers. Each thread held a name, a day, a breath. They wove the famine. They wove the thaw. They wove the year the bell rang for no reason, and the year it rang for every reason. What came out was neither blanket nor art. It was memory you could touch. They hung the woven piece above the hearth in the long house, where the firelight flickered through its layers. Visitors sat beneath it, and felt warmer, though they never knew why, and when someone asked what it was called, Leora whispered, "This is what we didn't forget." Chapter 31. The Moonbread Night. It began with flour and silence. One winter evening, when the snow came sideways and the wind rattled shutters like old bones, there was little left in the stores, only a handful of ground rye and a dried sprig of herb. Ellen's great-granddaughter, Miri, stood before the hearth and said, "We'll bake anyway." She shaped the dough into thin, round discs as soft as breath, small as her open hand. When they came from the fire, their surface shimmered faintly in the firelight, round and pale like the moon. They tasted of almost nothing, but not quite. There was warmth in them. And when they were shared, each person held the bread to their lips with a strange quiet joy. That night became known as Moonbread Night. From then on, even in seasons of plenty, the village baked moonbread once a year, not to feed the belly, but to feed the heart. And children learned, even the smallest offering, made with care, can feel like a miracle, especially when the moon is watching. Chapter 32. The bell that rang for one. Long ago, the bell atop the watch house was used only for danger, a lord's arrival, a sickness, a fire. But one early spring morning, before even the sun had lifted the frost from the grass, the bell rang once, a single chime. No danger. No call to arms. Just one note, long and clear. Villagers stepped out of their homes, confused. Ellen's grandson, now the village keeper, stood by the rope and said only, "She's awake." They climbed the hill in silence, one by one. There, in the smallest house, Annette, who had not spoken in many years, who had grown still as stone, was sitting up, gazing out her window, whispering a name no one understood. She smiled. And then she slept again. Not forever. Just peacefully, quietly. The bell did not ring again that day. But after that morning, the bell came to mean more than alarm. It meant witness. It meant you matter. And once each season, it rang once, not for fear, but for remembrance. Chapter 33. The Story in the Wall. When the barn roof was rebuilt, after a long summer storm had peeled it like bark, the workers discovered something tucked into the inner wall, between wooden slats and old straw. A story, carved in soft lines with a knife or nail. Not words, but pictures. A house with 7 windows. A tree with falling apples. A boy and girl holding hands. A great bird above them, wings spread wide. A river. A sun. A hand reaching up from the earth. The carving was old, a decades, maybe more. No name signed. But someone had lived. Had loved. Had remembered. So the villagers did not cover it. They sealed the barn around it, but left one panel open with a clear pane, like a window into time. And when storms passed, children were brought there to trace the images with their fingers and guess what the story meant. No one knew for sure, but they agreed it was important. Because in every carving, even the ones we don't understand, lives a wish, "Please let this remain." And it did. And so did they. Chapter 34. The Blanket That Remembered. When the last frost finally cracked and the birds returned, the oldest woman in the village, called simply Grandma, brought out a bundle wrapped in waxcloth. She had not touched it in years. Inside lay a blanket, patched so many times it no longer held a single piece of its original weave. One square was from her wedding dress, another from her mother's apron, still another, deep red, from a stranger's cloak, once traded for bread. Each patch held a moment, a loss, a laugh. A winter survived. Gran laid the blanket near the hearth in the long house, spread flat for all to see. Children sat upon it, their small hands running over worn seams. Adults came quietly in the evenings and added stitches, not to fix it, but to add themselves to it. Soon, a tradition began. If something mattered, truly mattered, a birth, a farewell, a harvest safe from rot, a piece of cloth was added. It became a living thing, not warm by touch, but by memory. And when Gran passed, wrapped in that fairy blanket, the villagers whispered she didn't go alone, and she hadn't. Chapter 35. The day the rain stopped. There came a summer so wet it seemed the sun had left the world. Crops drowned. Rivers rose. The air was thick with the scent of rot. Spirits grew heavy, and hope, like wheat, threatened to fall before it ripened. But then a pause. One morning, not a drop fell. Clouds drifted but didn't weep. The wind was soft. The earth exhaled. The villagers didn't cheer. They didn't shout. They listened. To the silence. To the breath of the hills. To the quiet shuffle of rabbits returning to the fields. A small girl, barely 4, walked into the center of the village square with outstretched arms and said, "It's dry. We can play again," and so they did. Not in wild joy but in gentle movement. A song hummed. A hand held. A stone skipped across a puddle. Later, they would plant again. Work again. Worry again. But that day, they simply let the stillness mend what the storm had broken. Sometimes, peace doesn't arrive with drums or trumpets. Sometimes, it just stops raining. Chapter 36. The map no one needed. In the heart of winter, when the snow had sealed every path and wolves howled far too close to the doors, Leora decided to draw a map. Not of the world, of them. She used bark and soot, needle ink, and careful hands. She marked every place that mattered: the hill where the geese nested, the tree with a face in its bark, the stone that listened, the barn with the picture wall. She added names, dates, notes like where Tom fell and laughed, or where the moon was biggest once. It was not a map anyone would use to travel. But when they looked at it, they remembered. Not roads. Not distances. But feelings. Where they had been, not just where they had gone. The map was hung above the village table. And when travelers came, asking where the roads led, the villagers simply pointed to it and said, "That's where we stayed," and no one ever got lost again. Chapter 37. The lantern that waited. It sat at the edge of the village, a simple iron lantern on a wooden post, facing the forest path. No one could remember who had placed it there first. Maybe it was Ellen. Maybe before her. But the rule was old and clear. The lantern was lit every nightfall, even if no one was expected. Just in case, the old ones would say. Just in case a traveler found their way. Just in case a lost child returned. Just in case someone had been gone too long and needed a light to follow home. For years, some nights it burned alone. But once, just once, a boy came walking out of the trees, barefoot, thin as a whisper. No one knew him. He said nothing. He only stared at the lantern for a long time, and then sat beneath it and slept. The villagers let him be. In the morning, he was gone, but not the lantern. It kept burning. Some said he was a ghost. Some said an angel. But most believed he was someone who had needed the light. And that was enough. Chapter 38. The bread with no yeast. The famine had lasted longer than most. No grain. No apples. Just nettles and broth. But then, someone remembered something. Old Tom, With his fingers to bent to farm but a memory still sharp, spoke one word: ash bread, the strange bread. No yeast, no rise. Just flour from bark, ash from clean wood, a little salt, a little courage. It wasn't good, but it was enough. They made it together, side by side, kneading, pressing, baking. And when the first one came from the fire, hard as stone and bitter, they passed it around like treasure. Because it was the first bite in weeks that came from them. Not from luck. Not from a passing Lord's charity. From their own hands. Even years later, in rich harvests, a piece of ash bread was left on the hearth once a season. A quiet thank you to the days they didn't starve, and the hands that fed them. Chapter 39. The well that sang. The well had always been there. Round, deep, covered in moss and thyme. People said it had no bottom. Children whispered that it could speak. One winter evening, when the frost clung to windows like lace, a girl leaned over the stone rim and sang, just a little hum, soft as wool. The sound echoed down, 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 and then came back, changed. As if the earth itself had sung with her. She tried again. Another note. And again, it returned warmer, fuller. Soon, more came. They didn't shout. They sang. Songs of old love. Lullabies. Harvest chants. And the well remembered. Each time someone sang, it gave back a new song, woven from every voice it had ever heard. It never repeated exactly. But always it soothed. And when the world was too loud, or too sharp, or too lonely, villagers would visit the well, close their eyes, and listen. And the well would sing back, you were here. You mattered. You sang, 40. The gloves made of stories. They were stitched from scraps of old wool, bits of leather, fur from a rabbit that had died long ago of natural cause. No two fingers matched. No two patches were the same. But when Elspeth handed them to her son before his first winter watch, she said, "These will keep your hands warm, but only if you remember each tale." Each piece came with a story. The green thread. From the shawl worn the day his sister was born. The black cuff. From the widow's coat, the one who taught them all to sing. The thumb. Lined with fur from the fox that once stole 3 chickens and made the children laugh instead of cry. Every finger, every seam a tale. And as the boy stood in the cold wind, hands in those patchwork gloves, he didn't just feel fabric. He felt all of them. And he was warm. Not just from wool. From belonging. 41. The soup that saved a life. It was the last turn of frost, and Marta had only a handful of dried peas, a bitter onion, and a memory of meat. Still, she boiled water. She peeled the onion slow, humming to herself. She stirred in herbs long forgotten on a shelf. A bit of stale bread. A prayer. The smell drifted down the lane, thin but kind. And when old John, who hadn't stood in weeks, caught the scent, he rose. He followed it like a dream, step by trembling step, until he reached her door. She said nothing. Just handed him a bowl, chipped and steaming. He wept as he ate. Not because it was grand, but because someone had cooked enough to share. Later, people called it the soup that brought John back, but it wasn't the soup. It was the gesture. The space made for another. Even when there was almost nothing. For 2. The secret window. In the back of the weaver's cottage, half hidden behind shelves of wool, was a small, queer window no larger than a loaf of bread. No one used it. It faced only the woods. But every night, just before sleep, the weaver's daughter opened it and whispered out a single word. Sometimes a hope. Sometimes a name. Sometimes just, thank you. She never heard anything back. Not at first. But one frost-heavy morning, when everything was still, she opened the window and found something on the sill, a pinnacone, dusted with snow. Another day, a twist of dried lavender. Once, a perfect acorn wearing a tiny cap of moss. She never saw who left them. Some said a spirit. Others, a fox, a child, a kindness. But no matter the truth, the girl left gifts too. A button, a ribbon, a song. And so it went. A window no one used, but one that connected to souls in silence across the breadth of the woods. A reminder that even in the smallest corners of life, we are seen. For 3. The barn that held more than hay. The old barn was crooked from time and tilted slightly to the left, like it was listening to the wind. It wasn't grand. It didn't even keep all the rain out, but it was more than a place for hay. It was where the village stored laughter in the summer, children hiding in bales and leaping into piles like kings of straw. It was where the old gathered in winter to mend tools, tell stories, and argue over who remembered the worst blizzard. And once, when the fever came again, it was where the sick were laid, away from the cottages, with lanterns left glowing and bread at the door. Some of them healed. Some of them didn't. But none of them were left alone. The barn remembered every soul. And even now, when the wind passes through the broken slats just right, it carries the soft sound of someone humming. As if the barn itself still sings. 44. The blanket with 100 names. No one knew who began it. Maybe it was sewn by Laura, after her sister passed. Maybe by Tom, after the Great Hunger. But someone stitched a name in crooked letters into the edge of a wool blanket. And the next day, another name appeared. And then another. Some were names of the living. Some were names of the lost. Each name held a memory. A kindness done. A song sung once. A shoulder offered in silence. The blanket grew heavier with time, not from weight, but from meaning. When someone was cold, they wrapped it around themselves and slept. And the names warmed them. Not the wool. The remembrance. Even when the names began to fade, the stitching frayed, and the colors paled, no one ever burned that blanket. They simply called it the one that held us. 45. The day the Lord's Son listened. He came on horseback, shining with new boots and polished gloves. His father had sent him to see the village. To count. To command. To learn power. But he saw something different. He saw a woman feeding 7 mouths from one pot. He saw a boy without shoes walking 5 miles for water. He saw a man give away the last of his bread and smile. And then he saw an old woman hand a baby to another and say, "You raise her now. I've given all I had." He didn't take notes. He didn't give orders. He just watched. And on the last night, as frost crept across the earth, he left behind something the village had never seen before: a box of clean bandages, a sack of oats, and a letter written by his own hand, left on the church step. "You have less than us, but more than we'll ever understand." He never returned, but the villagers remembered him, not as a lord, not even as a visitor, but as the one who saw us. 46. The candle that wouldn't go out. It was made from scraps left over, wax from prayer nights, a bit of thread from a child's torn shirt. Mara lit it one stormy evening when her husband was feverish and the roof groaned under snow. It flickered once, then stood tall. She whispered, "Just till morning," but morning came and it still burned. She left it at the window for luck. That week, no wolves howled near the fence. That month, her husband walked again. Soon, others came to sit near it to warm their hands, to speak of losses and dreams. Not because it was magic. Not because it gave light. But because it kept going. The candle burned for 7 nights. And on the 8th, when it was only a puddle, Mara said softly, "Some things shine long after they're gone." 47. The shoemaker who taught silence. His name was Breck, and he spoke very little. Not from pride but from listening. He mended shoes not just with thread, but with care, soft soles for the tired, firm ones for the unsteady, wide ones for those who had grown without noticing. But more than that, he listened. To the woman who cried without knowing why. To the farmer who missed his son. To the child who said he feared the moon. Breck never judged. Never rushed, he'd nod. Hand over a pair of shoes. And sometimes whisper just one line. These are for walking through the hard parts. And they always did. Even after he passed, villagers said they still felt his voice in the quiet moments. That if you walk barefoot in the snow and listen hard enough, you might hear him say, "Keep going. I'll meet you at the next bend." 48. The bell that rang itself. The church bell was heavy, rusted, and hadn't rung in years. Not since the last priest left and the roof caved in. But one night, during the longest cold spell the village had ever known, the bell rang once, twice. Then 3 soft chimes. No wind moved. No rope swung. And yet, the sound echoed through every cottage. People rose from their beds. They lit lanterns. They stepped into the snow and gathered near the church. No one spoke. They just stood close. Shared flasks. Passed bread. Watched the stars. And for a moment, the cold seemed distant. The hunger less sharp. The fear smaller. Later, someone said maybe it was a trick of frost. Others said it was the saints. But deep down, most believed this. The bell had remembered them. Just as they had always remembered each other. 49. The song without words. No one knew its name. No one remembered who first hummed it. But in the evenings, when the stars blinked gently and fire cracked in the center of the square, someone always began the tune. Just a low hum at first, a rise, fall. Others joined slowly, one by one. Children tapped rhythms with spoons. Old men nodded their heads in silence. The song carried no words. And yet it spoke of everything: the birth of a lamb, the smell of burnt barley, the empty space at the dinner table, the first snow, and the first spring after it. Travelers who heard it often cried. Not because they were sad, but because they remembered something they didn't know they'd forgotten. And even years later, far from the village, many would find themselves humming it quietly, while alone. As if the song had stayed with them, curled up inside their chest, warm and waiting. 50. The boy who gathered winter. His name was Ulrich, and he was small for his age. Too quiet, too pale, always with his hands in his sleeves. One winter, when the wind was cruel and the animals thin, he began collecting things. A feather left by a raven. A pine cone with frost still clinging to it. A thread from his mother's old shawl. He placed them in a box lined with moss. People laughed and said he was chasing ghosts. But he kept collecting. Ashes from the hearth. A sliver of bark with ice like glass. A single, curled hair from a lost dog. When spring finally came, and the snow melted at last, Ulrich opened the box and whispered, "So we don't forget what we came through." The village was quiet. Then someone added a stone shaped like a heart. Another, a spoon used to stir the last pot. By summer, the box had grown into a shelf. By next winter, it was called the memory corner. And even the oldest began to understand what the boy had known all along: winter, once survived, becomes part of who you are. 51. The stranger who left bread. She arrived without warning. No cart, no horse. Just boots muddy to the knees and a face wrapped in gray cloth. No one knew her name, and she didn't stay long. She passed through the village while snow still covered most of the fields. But each morning she was there. Someone would find something left quietly on a doorstep. A thick slice of oat bread. A bundle of firewood tied with twine. A vial of honey wrapped in wool. She asked for nothing. Spoke little. When she left, the children cried. But the gifts didn't stop. Every first snow since, even long after she'd vanished, the bread would reappear. The firewood. The honey. Villagers took turns pretending they'd left it just to keep the story alive. But deep down, They wondered. Maybe kindness, once planted, simply keeps growing. Even without a name. Even in the coldest soil. 52. The well that sang back. In the oldest part of the village, behind the crumbling chapel, stood a stone well. Its bucket had long disappeared. The rope frayed to threads. No one fetched water there anymore. But one dusk, a girl named Elspeth leaned over its edge and whispered, "Are you still listening?" She waited. And then faint, slow, as if the wind had learned to hum, came her words back to her. Only, softer, gentler. Like they'd been comforted and returned. The next night, she brought a friend. They sang a lullaby together, just once, into the well. And the well sang it back, not just in their voices, but layered older voices, deeper tones, harmonies that seemed to echo from other times. No one could explain it. But in the coldest months, when the world felt heavy, villagers would visit the well and leave a song. And always it would return a bit sweeter than before. As if the earth itself wished them peace. 53. The hidden room beneath the hearth. It was old Nan who found it, though she said she hadn't been looking. One morning, as she swept the ashes from her hearth, the bricks shifted. Just a little. A soft click beneath her broom. She knelt, curious, and pressed. A slab of stone lifted, revealing a hollow space beneath. Inside, a single stool. A candle stub. A clay cup. And along the walls, tiny scratches. Marks. Tally lines. A name, written over and over: Tomas. No one knew who he was. A runaway, a monk. A prisoner. But someone had lived in that silence. Sat through storms beneath the feet of others. Listened to the world move above, and waited. So Nan lit the candle. Placed the cup back gently. And closed the stone again. After that, every home began to check their hearth. Not for hidden rooms, but for stories. And in the telling, they found warmth where there had only been walls. 54. The night the sky opened. No one expected it. It had been an ordinary evening, stew simmering, boots drying, children nodding off. Then the wind stopped. Completely. So sudden that the fire went still. The silence pressed in. Then the sky bloomed. Not with stars, but with colors. Green and blue, pink and gold, dancing like fire across the heavens. Or as someone might have said, had they known the word. But the villagers didn't need a name. They only knew wonder. They stepped outside barefoot in the snow, breath held, heads lifted. For an hour, no one spoke. Even the dogs sat still, tails curled around paws, watching. Later, people said it was a sign that the world, for all its hunger and loss, still had beauty left in it. Maybe not often. Maybe not loud. But enough. Enough to believe in another morning. Enough to sleep a little easier that night. 55. The loaf that lasted. In the harshest winter of memory, when the grain stores had long been emptied and even the rats seemed to have vanished, one woman baked a loaf. Her name was Marga. She had one child, one candle, and just a handful of flour mixed with snow and root scraps. She whispered a blessing over it. Not from a book, just from the heart. The loaf was small. So small. She meant to divide it into 4 parts. But when she cut it, there were 6. Then 10. Then 12. Each piece warm. Each one steaming. She called her neighbors, sure it was only her tired eyes playing tricks. But they ate, and ate. And the bread did not run out until the last hand was fed. No one ever saw the likes of it again. But the stone oven where it was baked cracked, and old it was never torn down. Children were told it once gave more than we asked, and they believed. Because some ovens, like some hearts, remember the miracle of giving. 56. The cloak of many threads. It began with a patch. A square of green cloth, torn from an old tunic, sewn onto a frayed wool cloak to keep out the wind. Then another patch. Blue this time, from a curtain burned at the edges. Then red. Then yellow. Then silver, from a fallen lord's banner found in the mud. Each thread told a story. A wedding, a burial, a birth. By the time the cloak passed to the third wearer, it was heavy with memory. By the time the seventh child inherited it, it dragged slightly on the ground. But no one dared trim it. Instead, they added to it bits of lace, coins flattened by carts, even dried petals stitched into tiny pockets. It was not warm by design, but it was full. Full of days survived. Full of people remembered. By then, the cloak was so beloved, it no longer belonged to one person. It hung by the fire each winter and wrapped whoever needed it most. Because sometimes, comfort is not made new. It is made from everything that came before. 57. The pot that never broke. It was plain and glazed, misshapen, a bit too wide on one side. But it held stew again and again through war, through frost, through plague. It fell from the shelf once, cracked clean in two. But a farmer mended it with sap and cloth. And it held. It split again when dropped in the snow, and was repaired with straw and pitch. Still it held. Children used it to mix mud. Dogs chewed its rim. Lightning once struck the house above it. But the pot endured. Some said it was luck. Others said stubbornness. But most said, it lasted because we needed it to. When it finally crumbled, old and soft from time, the village didn't bury it. They ground the pieces into dust and spread it in the field where the barley grew strongest. And every season, the children whispered thanks to the barley. And the barley grew tall, golden, and full. Like it remembered. 58. The wine that carried names. During the darkest days of the plague, when bells tolled too often and doors were marked with sorrow, people began whispering names into the wind. It began with one mother, who had lost both sons in the same week. She stepped outside on a still morning, the frost silver on every leaf, and she said their names aloud. Elias, Tom. She said them gently, like a lullaby. The wind shifted, just barely, but it carried the names. And when her neighbors asked how she was surviving, she said, I think the wind remembers them. Soon others followed. Names were whispered into the sky at sunrise. Some wrote them on scraps of linen and tied them to tree branches. The village had no proper graveyard left. But in every breeze and every leaf that stirred, it felt like something had been kept, not gone. Just carried. Held high and soft. As if the earth itself refused to forget. 59. The lantern that burned blue. In a far cottage, half buried in ivy, lived a blind man named Wulfric. He had not seen a flame in decades, but every evening, he lit a small lantern near his window. The flame was not yellow. It burned blue. No one could explain it. The glow was ordinary. The wick, nothing special. But the blue glow was real, steady, calm, like moonlight wrapped in glass. At first, only travelers noticed. Then villagers began walking by at dusk, just to see. On nights when storms roared, the lantern never wavered. On nights when babies were born or someone slipped into death's arms, the light seemed to grow brighter. Wulfric never asked why. He simply said, it's here for whoever needs it. When he passed, the lantern remained still glowing, though no one touched it again. And people said the blue light was made of hope. The quiet kind. The kind you can walk toward, even when everything else is gone. 60. The feast beneath the ash tree. No one remembered who first suggested it, only that it happened one spring when the hunger had worn down even the strongest. The idea was this: everyone would bring something, a root, a bone, a crust of bread. Not for themselves, but for the center. They gathered beneath the ancient ash tree near the edge of the wood. One by one, they laid down their offerings. A few herbs, a pinch of salt, A cracked egg. It didn't look like much. But when a fire was lit, and a pot placed above, and everything added in was scent rose that made people weep. Warm. Rich. Unbelievable. They passed one bowl. Then another. And somehow, no one went hungry. Even the dogs curled up with full bellies. No one claimed it was magic. But the next year, they did it again. And again. And every time, the meal fed more than the ingredients should allow. Because when everyone gives a little, the hunger grows smaller. And the world, for one night, becomes enough. 61. The words on the wall. There was a wall behind the old blacksmith's house. Not tall. Not grand. Just stone upon stone, rough with moss and years. One winter morning, a child took a piece of coal and wrote upon it, "We are still here." The words were small, but they stayed. The next day, someone else added, "So are we." Then another hand wrote, "We keep each other warm." Within weeks, the wall was filled with messages. Some were poems. Some were prayers. Some were simply names of those who had made it through another day. No one erased anything. Even when snow fell and rain washed over the letters, they returned written by new hands. When sadness crept through the village, people came to read the wall and left feeling steadier. Not because the pain was gone, but because it had been shared. And sometimes, sharing is the first kind of healing. 62. The melody in the mist. He had no name, this traveler who came once every year, just as the first fog of autumn arrived. Wrapped in a cloak of deep gray, with a lute slung over his shoulder, he said nothing. But when he sat beneath the old elm and played, the village changed. The notes were soft, so soft you could almost forget you were listening. Yet each sound seemed to find something inside you that needed mending. The music didn't chase sorrow away. It held it, cradled it, made it gentle. The villagers never spoke while he played. They just listened. Children sat at their mother's feet. Old men wept silently. And when the last note fell, the traveler would rise and vanish into the mist again. No one ever saw where he went. But each year, they waited. Because some healing comes not from potions or prayers, but from melodies that say, "I know. I see you. You are not alone." 63. The letter with no name. It arrived with the frost to slip beneath the door of the weaver's cottage. No seal. No signature. Just a letter, written in soft brown ink on linen paper. It read, "You are not forgotten. You have made it further than you thought you could. The spring will come. And you will laugh again." The weaver wept. She had told no one how close she'd come to giving up. But the words found her. By morning, she had copied the letter and left it on someone else's doorstep. Then they did the same. And soon, dozens of homes had letters with the same message. Each one written by a different hand, each one sincere. No one ever claimed to be the first. Some said it was an angel. Others thought it was the spirit of the village itself. But no matter who had written it, the message became a promise. The cold may last, the hunger may ache, but your light is still burning, and someone sees it. 6. The mittens made of memory. There was a widow named Brida who had once been the finest spinner in her village. Her hands were now tired, her eyes dim, but each evening she still sat beside the hearth with her wool and her thoughts. She began to spin not from sheep's wool, but from bits of old fabric, a baby's bonnet, a strip from her husband's tunic, the sleeve of her mother's apron. From these, she made mittens. And when she gave them away, she told each person, "These are warm because they remember." One pair went to a boy who had lost his sister. Another to a girl who hadn't spoken in months. And somehow, when they wore Brida's mittens, they slept through the night. Smiled again. Breathed easier. Because the mittens carried stories, quiet, invisible ones, stitched deep into every thread. And in a world so full of forgetting, Brida's mittens helped people remember who they still were. 6-5. The blanket beneath the floorboards. One morning, when the snow had reached the top of the thatched roofs, a child fell sick, and no herbs would help. Her father, desperate, tore up the wooden floor in their tiny home, trying to dig beneath the frost for anything useful. What he found instead was an old woolen blanket, wrapped in linen and tucked beneath the boards. It was hand-stitched, faded, and smelled of rosemary and smoke. Folded inside it was a note for a child who was cold and loved. No one knew who had left it. The blanket was not magical, not famous, but when they wrapped the child in it, her fever eased. She grew stronger each day. And though they searched every old record, they never found the name of the one who left it there. But word spread. People began hiding things of blankets, jars of honey, dried plums, even poems beneath floorboards, into wall cracks, inside bread ovens. For strangers they'd never meet. For hope they might never see. But that was the point, kindness without witness. A love too quiet to ask for thanks. 66. The garden that grew at night. It began after the Great Famine, when even weeds seemed to vanish from the fields. A woman named Lean, who had lost 3 children and most of her hearing, began digging at night. Not because she believed it would help, but because she needed to move, to make space for her sorrow. She planted seeds others had given up on: apple cores, onion skins, dry peas. By moonlight, she worked in silence, whispering her grief into the soil. Then, one morning, she found a green shoot. Then another. By midsummer, her little garden was full of worms, roots, tomatoes, and even a thin plum tree. Neighbors wept when they saw it. And when she shared her harvest, she said only, "The earth remembers even what we forget." So others began planting under the stars. And the gardens that grew at night became symbols, not of miracle, but of patience. Of pain turned to beauty. Of what waits beneath, ready to rise, even when we think all is lost. 67. The shoes worn by 3 generations. There was a pair of leather shoes that had passed from one set of feet to another. First, they belonged to a boy named Ulrich, who had worn them to the market every week, carrying cheese wrapped in cloth. Then, years later, they were passed to his daughter, Mila, who danced in them on her wedding day beneath the stars. And then, they found their way to her son, who used them to walk to the monastery when his mother fell ill, to beg for medicine. The shoes were patched many times. The soles had been sewn with twine, then horsehair, then woven thread from an old basket. But they never tore completely. What made them special wasn't the leather, it was the love rubbed into every crease. Each person who wore them remembered the others. And so, when walking, they never felt alone. The shoes became a quiet inheritance, not of wealth, but of endurance. Of shared path and shared purpose. And when they were finally too worn to wear, they were placed on a shelf above the hearth. So the house would remember the miles it had survived. 68. The cradle that waited. The cradle sat in the back of a barn, tucked beneath blankets and grain sacks. No child had slept in it for years. It had belonged to Maren, whose only child had died during the sickness. She couldn't bear to give it away. But she also couldn't look at it. Still, she kept it safe, wiping away dust, mending its splinters, tucking lavender beneath its straw. "I'm just keeping it in case," she told herself. Though she never said what that case might be. Then one winter, a woman from another village arrived barefoot, half-starved, and with a newborn wrapped in rags. Maren brought them inside without a word. That night, she pulled the cradle from the barn and laid the child gently inside. It creaked softly, as though it had been waiting all this time to be useful again. And in the quiet that followed, Maren wept. Not from grief, but from relief. Because some things survive not just to remember the past, but to hold new beginnings, gently rocking them toward hope. 69. The door that was never locked. In the village of Draybridge, there was one house that had never had a lock. No one remembered why. Maybe the key was lost, or maybe the door was just always meant to open. The family who lived there, the Bakers, were known for their broth, their stories, and the fact that no visitor ever left hungry. When the plague came, fear took hold of every house. Doors were bolted, shutters closed, voices lowered to whispers. But the Baker house remained open. People brought their own spoons, sat far apart, and shared a pot that simmered from dawn to dusk. They spoke of grief, of dreams, of what had once been. No one was turned away. Children without parents found a bed in the attic. Travelers left notes of thanks carved into the beams. Years later, when the village recovered, the Baker house still had no lock. Because by then, the whole village had learned, an open door is sometimes stronger than any wall. 70. The cup that passed between hands. In a hamlet where the wells had long dried and the ground had cracked with thirst, there was a cup, a simple, wooden one, carved from yew by a man named Eber. It wasn't polished. It wasn't even round. But it held water like it held stories. Eber had used it to drink rainwater when his fields failed. Then, when he caught the coughing sickness, he passed it to his daughter with a whisper, "Let others drink before me." She did. The cup traveled. From that house to another. From farmer to widow. From a boy who fed the chickens to a girl who had just buried her father. It was never claimed, only borrowed. And each person who held it drank deeply and passed it on. By the time the river returned to the valley, the cup had circled the village more times than anyone could count. No one carved their name into it. They didn't need to. Because some things don't belong to people, they belong to the moment when someone decides to care. 71. The feather on the bread. When the last harvest failed, and the flour bin was nearly empty, people began baking with ground bark and wild rye. The loaves were small, bitter. But they were food. One morning, an old woman named Ada brought a tiny loaf to the chapel. On top, she placed a single white feather. She didn't explain. Just left it by the door. The next day, someone else brought a loaf and a blue bead. Then, another brought a crust and a sprig of thyme. Each offering was humble. But each came with something beautiful, a ribbon, a button, a shell. And people began to eat together again, not just to survive, but to remember joy. They laughed at the odd decorations, told stories about where the items came from. That bead was from my wedding tunic. That shell from my brother's trip to the southern coast. And though the bread was still small, it no longer felt like suffering. Because every bite was touched by beauty, however small, however strange. And even hunger became less frightening when shared with grace. 72. The map with no names. In a leather pouch tied to the belt of a wandering weaver, there was a map drawn in charcoal on cloth. It showed no names. Just rivers. Trees. Curving roads. Dots where houses once stood. The weaver had lost her home years ago, swallowed by fire and forgotten by lords. But she remembered where it had been. So she began drawing. At each village she visited, she asked the elders, "Where did your granaries stand? Where were the orchards? The bridges?" She added them to her cloth. When she found places that had disappeared, she didn't erase them. She circled them in red thread. "These places matter," she said. "Even if no one remembers." One day, a child asked, "But what's the point of a map with no names?" And she smiled. "Because names fade. But land remembers. And so do we." The map never helped anyone travel faster. But it helped them feel less lost. Because in every forgotten bend of the road, they saw themselves still here, still walking. 73. The bell that rang without a rope. In the crumbling stone chapel near the edge of the woods, there was a bell. Its rope had long rotted away, and no one had dared climb to ring it since the plague swept through the valley. Still, the bell remained. Children said it moved on its own during storms. Old folks said it rang when a soul passed. But mostly, it was silent. Until one spring, a boy named Lyre climbed the chapel tower, barefoot and trembling. He didn't go for mischief. He went because the village had buried another elder that day. And there was no one left who remembered how the bell sounded. At the top, he tied a rope made from braided shawls and tugged hard. The sound echoed through the trees like a memory returning home. People stepped out of their houses. The shepherds paused on the hillsides. Mothers held their children a little closer. It wasn't just a sound. It was a signal. We are still here. And we still remember. And every week after that, the bell rang once, not to mark sorrow, but to remind everyone that silence does not mean forgetting. 7. Forgot the bread that waited on the stone. Near the edge of the market square, there was a flat stone the size of a barrel lid. Nobody knew why it was there. But one winter, a farmer left a loaf of barley bread on it just in case someone needed it more than he did. He didn't tell anyone. But by morning, the bread was gone. The next night, another loaf appeared. Then a wedge of cheese. Then a handful of dried apples. No one said a word. But the stone became a quiet promise between strangers. Years passed. Famine came and went. Wars flickered like torches on the horizon. But the stone was never empty. Even when people had little, they left something. And when they had nothing, they came quietly and took never too much, never too often. One day, a traveler asked the village elder who owned the stone. The elder smiled gently. The hungry do. And so do those who remember what it's like to be hungry. 7.5. The ladder of wine and wood. Behind an abandoned barn stood a crooked ladder missing two rungs and covered in moss. But children still climbed it. They used it to reach the roof where pigeons gathered in the evenings, or to pretend they were kings, or to look out across the barley fields and imagine being old enough to leave. One day, the barn collapsed in a storm. But the ladder remained leaning now against nothing but air. A man named Tobin, who had once climbed that same ladder as a boy, pulled it upright again. He hammered it to a tall tree. "You still reach somewhere," he said. From then on, children climbed it to hang ribbons, to tie bells, to whisper their wishes into the wind. And when travelers came through, they saw it, the ladder reaching to nowhere and everywhere. Some laughed. Some stared. But those who had once known hunger or sorrow simply nodded. Because sometimes, it isn't where a ladder leads. It's that someone believed it could still lift you higher. 7.6. The quilt that held the sky. In the farthest cottage on the hill, where wind whispered under the door and snow reached the windows, lived a widow named Mirwin. She had once sewn clothes for the nobleman's house, but when her fingers stiffened with age, the work ceased. All she had left were scraps of cloth as soft, worn, and torn from better times. So, she began to stitch. Each piece she added to the quilt told a story: a green square from her husband's tunic, a blue one from her daughter's childhood dress, a corner of red from the cloth she'd been married in. As the nights grew longer, the quilt grew larger, and heavier, and warmer. Soon, villagers began bringing her scraps of their own. A child's mitten, a broken apron tie, the hem of a wedding veil. She stitched them all together with fingers slow but steady. And when someone could no longer sleep from cold or grief, they came to her door. She would hand them the quilt for one night. Wrapped inside it, people said the cold didn't hurt. The wind didn't howl. And sometimes they dreamed of warm bread, laughter, or the feeling of being held. Mirwin's quilt never stopped growing. And somehow, even as more cloth was added, it never frayed. Some said it held the sky together. Others said it simply remembered love. 77. The song sung to the trees. There was a boy named Dallin who never spoke in crowds, but sang when alone. He believed the trees listened, especially the old ones near the frozen stream. One day, during the deepest frost, the elders asked if anyone could lift the spirit of the sick and shivering. No priest came. No bard wandered near. So Dallin went into the woods. He knelt beneath the bare limbs and began to hum low and slow, like water under ice. The trees did not move, but the wind changed. It softened. When he returned, he began to sing beside the hearts of the weak. Not words, just melodies that rose and dipped like distant hills. The sick rested easier. Children fell asleep without crying. And after some time, people said the trees near the stream began to bloom before the frost melted. Was it true? No one knew. But Dallin sang each evening. And the forest, even in winter, no longer felt empty. 78. The bridge that no one built. There was a stream between two villages, neither deep nor wide, but cold enough to freeze the feet and flood when storms came. 4 years, neither village built a bridge. They blamed each other. They waited for the lords. They said the cost was too high, the work too hard. So people crossed when they could and turned back when they couldn't. Then one morning, a plank appeared, just one. The next day, two. A farmer had brought the first. A shepherd brought the second. No one announced it. No one asked for thanks. Within a week, the bridge stood uneven, slightly tilted, made from firewood and broken fence posts. But it held. People began to cross more often. To share grain. To visit kin. And when heavy rains came and the stream rose, they didn't retreat. They rebuilt. No one claimed the bridge. And no one ever named it. But travelers often stopped, sat in the middle of it, and said it felt like the kind of place built not by hands, but by hearts that had decided to stop waiting. 79. The lantern that was never lit. In the center of the village stood an old iron lantern, mounted on a post that leaned slightly westward, as if tired of standing so many winters. No one had lit it in years. The oil was long gone, the glass cracked, the wick brittle. But still, every evening, someone would pass by and touch the post gently, like greeting an old friend. Children whispered that it still gave light, but only to those who were lost. One night, during a snowstorm, a traveler from another town lost his way in the white silence. He stumbled toward the village with frozen boots and numb hands. And though he never saw a flame, he said he followed a pale glow, not warm, but kind. He arrived at the village square just before collapsing. They found him beneath the lantern. And after that, no one spoke of relighting it. Because perhaps, some lights glow better when no one is watching. And perhaps not every light is meant to be seen. Some, like hope, simply guide us silently, steadily at home. 80. The spoon that fed 100. There once lived an old man named Helric who had nothing but a wooden spoon carved from a tree that had grown behind his mother's cottage. He stirred everything with it, a stew, porridge, even melted snow. But one year, after the barley crop failed and the rabbits vanished into their winter burrows, the villagers were left with only roots and bitter herbs. People began to eat in silence. Children cried through the night. So Helric came to the center of the village with an empty pot and his spoon. He said nothing. He simply sat and stirred. At first, people laughed. Then one woman brought a sprig of thyme. A boy added a handful of beans. An old woman dropped in the last turnip from her cellar. By sundown, the pot was full, steaming and fragrant. Helric served it to everyone with the same spoon. People said it tasted better than any noble's feast. The next night, they returned. And again. And though the food changed, Helric never stopped stirring. They said it was the spoon. That it remembered every hunger and every kindness. And when Helric passed, they placed the spoon in the village chapel, not as a relic, but as a promise. That no one would eat alone again. 81. The silence that healed. Not every wound bled. And not every pain screamed. There was a woman named Farah who had lost both sons to winter fever. After that, she did not speak, not a word. Some thought her heart had frozen, like the pond near the blacksmith's shed. Others thought the grief had stolen her breath. She moved quietly, tending the sheep, patching the church roof, bringing broth to the sick. And though she never said a thing, people began to feel calmer in her presence. Children stopped bickering near her. The dying relaxed when she entered the room. It was as if her silence soaked up the noise of sorrow and gave back only stillness. One spring, a young girl who had lost her father sat beside Farah and said, "It hurts." Farah said nothing. She simply took the girl's hand. And that night, the girl slept for the first time in weeks. Farah never spoke again. But those who sat near her said they heard something, not with their ears, but with their hearts. A kind of hush that made grief less heavy. A quiet that said, "You are not alone." 82. The chair by the fire. In the oldest cottage near the orchard, there was a single chair by the hearth. It was crooked in the legs and wrapped in old wool around the arms, where countless hands had rested. It belonged to no one, but it held everyone. If you had lost someone, you could sit in the chair. If you had walked too far in the snow, it would be there. If your hands trembled from fear or from age, the chair would hold them steady. It did not speak, of course. But when you sat, your breathing slowed. And the fire always seemed to crackle a little more gently. Over time, the chair became a kind of prayer made not of wood, but of memory. People said that even the Lord's steward, once sent to collect late taxes, sat in the chair and forgot why he had come. And when the cottage finally fell, after many winters and no repairs, the chair was found and touched among the ruins. Dry, clean, waiting. They moved it to the center of the village. And it still waits. 83. The hen who stayed. During one especially cruel winter, when wolves had come close and food had nearly run out, the villagers had to let go of many animals. Some ran. Some were taken. Some were eaten. But one hen, small and patchy with old feathers, refused to leave. She stayed near the smithy, under the broken cart, plucking softly at shadows and scratching in the frozen straw. Each morning, against all odds, she laid one egg. One. Enough for a sick child. Enough for the old woman who could not chew. Enough to trade for a root or a smile. They began to call her mother. They built her a small shelter of stones and old cloth, and even the gruffest men began to greet her like kin. When spring came and the snow melted into mud, she still laid one egg a day. But by then, they no longer needed them. So they left them there beside her as thanks. She never ate them. She only sat near them, warming them until one morning, one cracked. Then another. Then three more. And the chicks, tiny and blinking, were quiet as snow. 84. The door that was never locked. There was one cottage that never latched its door. Even in the deepest cold, even during plague years, it stayed slightly ajar. Not enough for the wind, but enough for someone who needed shelter. No one knew who owned it. It was always tidy, though bare. A pot beside the hearth. A blanket by the wall. A bucket of water that never froze. Travelers came and stayed a night. A woman fleeing the Lord's men once stayed a week. A boy who had lost his mother stayed until spring. And when they left, they always left it better than they found it. A dry loaf on the table. A new twig broom. An extra candle near the window. Over time, the villagers stopped asking who it belonged to. They simply said, "If you need rest, go to the open door," and it was always there. Open. Waiting. Like kindness. Like grace. 85. The mittens that traveled. They were not fine mittens. One was a little longer than the other, and both had patches of different wool: gray, brown, cream. They had no buttons, no ribbons, no markings. But they were the warmest in the village. No one kept them long. One winter, a child named Toma received them when his hands began to blister from the cold. He wore them for 3 weeks, until his grandmother recovered from fever. Then he left them on the chapel steps. A shepherd found them the next day and wore them while birthing a calf during a snowstorm. He returned them, clean and folded, on a tree stump. The mittens passed like that, quietly, from hands to hands. To a widow who was chopping wood. To a man who had lost a thumb to frost. To a girl who still cried at night. No one ever asked who made them. They simply appeared when most needed. By the time spring arrived, the mittens were thinner, but somehow still warm. 86. The bell that rang for no one. There was a small iron bell that hung in the belfry above the mill. It wasn't used to call to church, nor to warn of fire or wolves. It rang only when no one was there. Sometimes at night. Sometimes at dawn. Always when the sky was quietest. People said it rang when a soul passed alone. When someone slipped away in the woods. When a child's name was whispered only once. The villagers never climbed the belfry to see who rang it. Instead, they listened. And each time the bell rang, they lit a candle and left it on their windowsill. One evening, it rang 3 times as slow, soft, distant. By morning, there were candles in every window. And though no name was spoken, everyone seemed to walk more gently that day, as if remembering someone they never met. 87. The blanket sewn from silence. Elspeth was the quietest woman in the valley. She spoke no harsh words. She argued with no one. She never raised her voice even when the Lord's men took her barley. Instead, she sewed scraps of old tunics, a threadbare flag, strips of cloth from children's smocks, too small to mend. She sewed slowly, steadily, every evening by the fire, until the blanket grew larger than her lap, then longer than her arms. She sewed into it moments of kindness, a piece from her father's scarf, a strip from her mother's apron, a corner from a shawl once shared in grief. When it was done, she placed it on the chapel bench. No one took it. But on the coldest nights, someone would sit there, and sleep would come more quickly. The blanket didn't warm bodies, it warmed memory. And no one dared take it away. Because somehow, the silence inside it sang. 88. The song beneath the floorboards. There was a cottage, small even by peasant standards, where the floorboards creaked like whispers. Under those old planks, past dust and straw, lived a song. No one knew who placed it there. No instrument played it. No voice ever fully carried it. But it was always there. Children who slept in the cottage dreamed better dreams. They said they heard soft humming, like a lullaby woven from the breath of the earth itself. A boy named Elias, who stuttered and feared the dark, once spent the winter in that house. By spring, he no longer stuttered. And the dark. He welcomed it, for the song sang clearer when night fell. Old Nan, who had buried 2 sons, came to rest her bones by that hearth. She wept her grief into the boards. The song caught every tear and hummed back something she never forgot. Some believed it was the voice of the land. Some thought it was stitched from all the quiet kindness ever left unspoken. But most simply said, sleep in that house when your soul is tired. 89. The candle that wouldn't die. Long ago, during a harsh winter that took more than it gave, a small tallow candle was placed in the chapel window. It was meant to burn for one night only and for the memory of a lost child. But when morning came, it was still lit. They left it, assuming the wind would take it by nightfall. But night came and the candle still burned. It did not drip. It did not fade. It simply glowed. It became a quiet mystery. Children left berries beneath it. Widows touched their fingers to the window pane, whispering names. Even the Lord's men passed it in silence. Through plague, fire, and mourning, the candle kept its flame. They tried to move it once, during a storm. But when taken from the window, it went out instantly. Returned, it lit again by itself. It was never worshipped. It was never explained. It simply stood watch in the night, a light for the forgotten. And as long as one person remained in the village to see it, it never went out. 90. The spoon that fed 100. There was a wooden spoon, cracked and darkened by years, hanging from a nail in the communal barn. It belonged to no one. But whenever food was scarce, and it often was, villagers would pass the spoon from pot to pot, bowl to bowl, stew to stew. Strangely, there was always enough. One winter, a pot of onion broth meant for 3 fed 12. A crusty barley mash fed a whole wedding gathering. And once, with nothing but nettle tea, the spoon stirred long enough to quiet every stomach. No one spoke of it aloud. They feared, perhaps, to break whatever quiet magic the spoon carried. When someone new came to the village, they were never told the story. They simply noticed the spoon plain, small, carved by a hand now long buried. And they understood. Some things do not need words. Some kindnesses speak through use, not noise. It still hangs in the barn, waiting. For hunger, for hope. For someone who still believes. 9:1. The day the Lord did not return. There was a time each spring when the Lord's men would ride through the village. They'd take oats. They'd count sheep. They'd slap tired faces with cold gloves and speak of taxes and war. But one year, they did not come. At first, the villagers were afraid. What did it mean, this silence? Was it a trick? A trap? They kept their heads down. Fields were sown in silence. Stew pots stayed thin. But by midsummer, something strange had happened. The people stood taller. They laughed more carefully at first, then freely. Bread was shared not from duty but from joy. When a child was born, the bell rang early, and the whole valley smiled. That year, no one stole grain from the mill. No one needed to. And in the fields where the Lord's boots once pressed cruel prints into the soil, wildflowers grew. 9 to dot the blanket of names. There was a girl named Mira, born during the Great Hunger. She grew quiet, watching the world with eyes too old for her face. When she turned 12, she began collecting names. Not from the living, from the forgotten. She would sit beside the old, the tired, the nearly gone. She would ask for the names of those they'd lost: brothers, mothers, lovers, neighbors. Names too heavy for others to carry. Mira stitched every name into a blanket. She worked for years. The cloth stretched across her floor, then up her walls. It grew heavier, warmer, filled with thread and memory. By the time she was 30, the blanket held over 1,000 names. She draped it across the chapel on the coldest nights. And every time someone slept beneath it, they dreamed of someone they'd never met, but somehow still missed. 9-3 the dream that carried them forward. In the last years of the long winter, when the trees were still bare and the soil unsure, the people began to dream. Not of kings. Not of gold. Not even of warmth. They dreamed of tomorrow. In the dreams, children no longer shivered in corners. No plague roamed through the fields. The Lord's banners were gone, replaced by tall stalks of wheat and circles of dancers in the sun. And in the dreams, they were together. They dreamed of bread thick with honey, of songs sung without fear, of stories told beside a hearth that never went cold. The villagers never spoke of the dream, but each of them carried a piece of it, tucked behind the ribs. And though many did not live to see that dream made real, they passed it forward. In lullabies. In wooden spoons. In the way they left mittens on chapel steps, and lit candles for no reason. So that even now, hundreds of years later, in the hush between wind and sleep, that dream still lingers and waits for you.